In the spaces between stars, time moves differently.
Not the time measured by atomic decay or orbital mechanics, but the deeper time that settles into the bones of civilizations. The kind of time that transforms empires into legends, legends into myths, and myths into dust scattered across the cold geometry of space.
Fleet Commander Varan had lived long enough to understand this. His species, the Valkyrie, had charted these corridors between galaxies when humanity's ancestors were still learning to shape stone into tools. They had built stations around dying stars, seeded life on barren worlds, and conducted wars that had reshaped the topology of space itself.
Now, watching the tactical display flicker with the deathlights of another destroyed fleet, Varan felt the weight of those millennia pressing down upon his thoracic plates like a physical burden. 12,000 years of expansion.
8 billion souls across 47 systems. And in 6 months, the Vrethkai swarm had reduced them to refugees fleeing through the dark.
He stood alone on the observation deck of the Eternal Consideration, the last battlecruiser of the Fourth Ascendancy Fleet, watching stars drift past like cold accusations. Behind him, through sealed bulkheads and emergency barriers, what remained of his people huddled in converted cargo bays. Scientists, artists, children, the fragments of a civilization that had once believed itself eternal.
Commander.
Varan did not turn. He recognized the voice of his tactical officer, Shenvara, by the particular way her mandibles clicked when she was suppressing distress. Report. The Vrethkai have taken the Orin system. The defensive stations held for 19 hours. 19 hours. The Orin system had housed the greatest shipyards in Valkyrie space. 300 million souls had lived on those orbital platforms, building the vessels that were supposed to protect them. Survivors?
Shenvara's silence was answer enough.
Varan closed his secondary eyes, a gesture of grief his species made when they had no words left. And the confluence?
Still refusing to intervene, they claim the swarm has not violated their territorial boundaries. A bitter edge crept into Shenvara's voice. They express their condolences for our losses.
Condolences. The word tasted like ash. The confluence, that vast coalition of elder species who had watched the galaxy spin for 100,000 years, had offered precisely nothing but diplomatic sympathy while the Valkyrie burned. Varan had expected nothing else. The universe did not care for the dying. It simply watched, vast and indifferent, while civilizations rose and fell like waves against an endless shore. "We have received a response from our final query," Shenvara said, and something in her tone made Varan finally turn.
Which query?
The humans. The name hung in the air between them, charged with implications that neither of them fully understood. The humans. That strange, short-lived species from the galaxy's outer arm, the ones who had appeared on the galactic stage barely 3 centuries ago with their crude ships and their unsettling persistence. The Valkyrie had dismissed them, of course. Every elder species had. The humans were too young, too fragile, too mortal to matter. They burned through their brief lives with such intensity that watching them was almost painful, like observing insects that had somehow gained sapience, forever rushing toward deaths that came far too quickly.
What did they say?
Shenvara extended a data tablet. They have offered sanctuary. Varan took the tablet, scanning the contents with growing confusion. The message was brief, almost absurdly so compared to the elaborate diplomatic protocols of elder species. It contained navigational coordinates,
a frequency for contact, and a single line of text. "You are welcome here. Come as you are." This is all?
Yes, Commander.
He studied the coordinates. They pointed to a system far from the major trade routes, a small yellow star orbited by unremarkable worlds. Human space. Terra's children had spread across perhaps 40 systems, a trivial territory compared to what the Valkyrie had once held.
"They cannot possibly defend us," Kethvaran said. "Their fleet is a fraction of what we lost in the first month of fighting. If we bring the swarm to their doorstep—" "With respect, Commander, we have nowhere else to go." The truth of it settled over him like a shroud. The confluence had closed their borders. The hegemony had retreated into their fortress systems. Every ancient power in this arm of the galaxy had decided that survival meant isolation, and none of them were willing to risk their own existence for a dying people.
All except the humans.
"Set course for the coordinates," Kethvoron said finally, "and pray to whatever gods still listen that we are not leading the swarm to slaughter the one species foolish enough to help us."
The journey took 11 days. 11 days of jumping between stars, running silent through the spaces between systems, praying that the Vrethkai hunting packs had not yet picked up their trail. 11 days of rationing food and water, of holding funeral rites for those who died from injuries sustained in the last battle, of listening to children cry for parents who would never answer. Kethvaran spent those days reviewing everything the Valkyrie archives contained about humanity. It was not much. Fragments of trade agreements, observations from distant survey probes, a few academic papers written by xenoanthropologists who had studied human culture with the same detached curiosity they might apply to any other primitive species. The picture that emerged was confusing. Humans were fragile. Their bodies broke easily, succumbed to disease, aged rapidly, and failed in ways that seemed almost designed for maximum inefficiency. Their lifespans averaged less than a century, barely enough time for a Valkyrie to complete their basic education. They had achieved interstellar travel in less than 3 centuries after their first powered flight. They had survived a succession of extinction-level events that would have destroyed most species. They had built a functioning interstellar society despite their individual mortality, creating institutions that outlived generations. None of this explained why they had offered sanctuary to a dying people they had never met. On the final day of the journey, as the eternal consideration approached the edge of the human system, Kethvaran received a communication request from an incoming vessel.
"Commander, we're being hailed."
By whom? The vessel identifies itself as the Humble Greeting. It's a human ship, civilian registration, light transport class. Kethvaran's mandibles clicked in confusion. They were refugees, survivors of the greatest massacre in Valkyrie history, and humanity had sent a civilian transport to greet them? Except the communication. The holographic display flickered to life, and Kethvaran found himself looking at his first human. She was small, barely half his height, wrapped in practical clothing that showed signs of wear. Her face was softer than he had expected, with features that seemed designed for expressiveness rather than defense. Dark hair was pulled back from her forehead, and her eyes, strange, round, single-pupiled eyes, held an expression he could not quite read. "Fleet Commander Kethvaran?" Her voice was low and steady, carrying through the translation matrix with only slight distortion. "Yes." "I'm Elena Vasquez. I'll be your first point of contact. We've prepared berthing facilities at Anchor Station for your people. Quarters, medical support, food. Everything should be compatible with your species' requirements. But please let us know if we've missed anything." Kethvaron stared at her. The Velkari had not provided any biological specifications. They had not discussed requirements, protocols, or terms. They had simply sent a desperate plea to anyone who might listen.
How did you know what we would need?
Elena's expression shifted slightly, a movement of muscle around her mouth and eyes that he could not interpret. We had some records on file, and we've learned to prepare for the unexpected. She paused. Your people are safe here, Commander. Whatever you need, we'll figure it out.
I must be honest with you, Kethvaron said. We are being hunted. The Vrethkai swarm.
We know about the swarm.
Then you know what we are bringing to your border, if they track us here.
Let us worry about that. Elena's voice remained calm, almost gentle. For now, just focus on your people. They've been through enough.
The communication ended, and Kethvaron stood in silence, trying to process what had just occurred. He had expected negotiations, demands, conditions. He had expected the humans to extract something in return for their aid: technology, resources, strategic information.
Instead, they had simply offered help.
Anchor Station hung in orbit around the fourth planet of the human system, a massive structure of interconnected modules that stretched across several kilometers. It was functional rather than elegant, built for purpose rather than prestige. The Velkari had constructed stations that were architectural masterpieces, testaments to their aesthetic sophistication. This was not that. But as the eternal consideration approached and the docking protocols engaged, Kethvaron noticed something else. The station was designed for modularity. New sections had been added recently, quickly, efficiently, without concern for visual harmony. Quarters large enough for Velkari physiology, medical facilities equipped with unfamiliar but sophisticated equipment, recreational spaces adapted for different gravitational preferences. They had built all of this in 11 days.
Commander? Shinvara appeared beside him, her expression unreadable. The humans are requesting permission to begin evacuation of our civilians.
Evacuation?
They want to transfer our wounded to their medical facilities and our children to the prepared quarters. They say our people have spent enough time in cargo bays. Kethvaron felt something shift in his chest, an emotion he did not have a name for. Grant permission. Over the next several hours, he watched as human teams moved efficiently through his ship, carrying wounded Velkari to waiting medical shuttles with surprising care. They spoke in low voices, asked questions about allergies and religious requirements, and handled the smallest children with a gentleness that seemed at odds with their strange, blunt-fingered hands. One of them, a young male with skin the color of copper, stopped to speak with an elderly Velkari woman who had lost her entire family in the fall of the Keth system. Kethvaron watched as the human knelt beside her, listening to her speak, nodding even though the translation must have been imperfect. He stayed with her for nearly 20 minutes, holding her hand in both of his, before gently guiding her toward the waiting transport.
They're strange, Shinvara said quietly.
Yes. They act as though they genuinely care.
Kethvaron did not respond. He did not know what to make of any of this. The meeting with the human leadership took place in a conference room aboard Anchor Station. The space was simple, a circular table, comfortable seating adapted for Velkari physiology, soft lighting that did not strain his secondary eyes. Everything was functional, thoughtful, and utterly unremarkable. 3 humans sat across from him. Elena Vasquez was there, still dressed in her practical clothing, looking tired but alert. Beside her sat an older man with gray hair and deep lines around his eyes, Admiral Marcus Chen, according to the introduction. The third was a young woman who had not been named, but who watched everything with an intensity that made Kethvaron uncomfortable. "We've completed the initial settlement of your people," Alina said. "Quarters, food, medical care, all sorted, at least for now. We'll make adjustments as we learn more about what you need." "You have our gratitude," Kethvaron replied. The words felt inadequate. "We came to you with nothing to offer. We are refugees, running from a threat we could not defeat. You had no reason to help us." Admiral Chen leaned forward slightly. "We had every reason. The swarm is a galactic threat that will eventually reach every corner of settled space, including ours." The Admiral's voice was calm, measured. "We're not helping you out of charity, Commander. We're helping you because it's the right thing to do, and because standing together is how you survive something like this." Kethvaron studied the human's face, searching for deception. His species had millennia of experience reading political motivations, identifying hidden agendas, understanding the complex games that ancient powers played. He found none of that here. Just certainty. "You do not understand what you are facing," Kethvaron said. "The Vrethkai swarm is not a conventional enemy. They do not negotiate, do not accept surrender, do not show mercy. They consume. That is all they do. They have destroyed civilizations older than yours, older than mine. Your fleet—" He hesitated, unsure how to phrase this diplomatically. "Our fleet is small," Admiral Chen finished for him. "We know."
"Then how can you sit there so calmly?"
The Admiral glanced at Elena, then at the young woman who had remained silent throughout the meeting. Something passed between them, a communication Kethvaron could not interpret.
"Commander," Elena said, "can I ask you something personal?"
The question surprised him. "Of course."
"When you realized your people were going to lose this war, how did you feel?" Kethvaron's mandibles clicked involuntarily. The question cut deeper than any tactical analysis could. "I felt despair, rage, fear. Everything we had built, everything our ancestors had achieved over 12,000 years, it was ending, and there was nothing I could do to stop it." Elena nodded slowly. "Humanity has felt that way before, more than once." "When?" "We nearly destroyed ourselves, several times actually. Nuclear weapons, climate collapse, pandemic. We came closer to extinction than most species ever know. There were generations that grew up believing they would be the last. Children who learned to hide from bombs before they learned to read." She paused, and something in her expression shifted, a shadow crossing behind her eyes. "We understand despair, Commander. We understand what it means to face annihilation and see no way out. That's why we're helping you. Not because we're confident we can win, but because we know what it feels like to have no one come when you cry for help." The room fell silent. Kethvaron felt something crack in his chest, some barrier he had built to survive the last 6 months. These strange, short-lived creatures understood. Not as an abstract concept, but in their bones, in their cellular memory. "The swarm will come," he said quietly. "They always find their prey." "We know," Admiral Chen replied. "We're counting on it." Over the following weeks, Kethvaron learned more about humanity than all the Velkari archives contained.
He learned that they did not sleep in single long periods like his people, but in cycles of activity and rest that seemed chaotic until you understood the rhythm. He learned that their primary form of bonding involved the preparation and sharing of food, and that they would go to extraordinary lengths to make their guests feel welcome at their tables. He learned that they laughed easily, a strange barking sound that initially startled him, and that humor was their primary mechanism for coping with stress. They made jokes about death, about fear, about the very extinction they faced. Not because they did not take it seriously, but because laughter was how they survived. He learned that they argued constantly among themselves, debating strategy and policy with a passionate intensity that would have paralyzed Valkyrie governments. But when decisions were made, they unified behind them with a discipline that seemed impossible for such an individualistic species. And he learned, slowly, that they were not afraid. Not in the way they should have been. The Vrethkai swarm had destroyed civilizations that had existed for longer than humans had possessed fire. They had consumed fleets that dwarfed anything humanity could field. They were the closest thing to an unstoppable force that the galaxy had ever produced.
And the humans treated them like a logistics problem.
"We've been analyzing the swarm's attack patterns," Elena said during one of their regular briefings. "Your tactical data has been invaluable. They're predictable once you understand their consumption priorities."
They are not predictable, Kethvoron replied sharply. They adapt, evolve, overcome every defense. We studied them for months before the war, and nothing we learned helped us survive.
You studied them as a military threat. We're studying them as an organism. She pulled up a holographic display, charts, graphs, behavioral models. Kethvoron recognized the underlying data. It came from his own fleet's recordings. But the analysis was different, approaching the problem from angles he had never considered. They're not intelligent in the way we usually define it, Elena continued. They're more like a distributed ecosystem. Individual units respond to stimuli, but the overall behavior emerges from simple rules applied at massive scale. If you can predict the rules, you cannot defeat them with prediction. We tried. Every species that has fought them has tried. They simply overwhelm whatever defenses you construct. Elena nodded. Because everyone has tried to fight them the same way. Defense, fortification, attrition, trying to hold ground against an enemy that has functionally infinite numbers.
"There is no other way."
There's always another way, Commander. That's sort of our thing.
Kethvoron stared at her, searching for the arrogance that should have accompanied such a statement. He found none. Just quiet confidence, the kind that came from absolute certainty in one's own capabilities.
It unnerved him.
The swarm found them 63 days after the Valkyrie arrived. Kethvoron was in the observation lounge when the alarms began, a soft melodic tone that seemed entirely inappropriate for the announcement of their doom. Around him, human personnel moved with urgent but controlled efficiency, heading to their stations without panic or shouting. "Commander Kethvoron," Admiral Chen's voice came through the communication system. "We need you in the command center." He made his way through corridors that hummed with activity. Every human he passed was focused, purposeful, moving as part of a larger pattern he could not quite perceive. There was no fear in their faces, no despair, just intense, focused concentration. The command center was built around a massive holographic display that showed the system in real time, and what it showed made Kethvoron's blood run cold. Thousands of contacts, tens of thousands. The swarm had committed a force larger than anything they had deployed against the Valkyrie, a mass of organic vessels and harvester drones that blackened the sensor displays with their sheer numbers.
"They brought more than they used against us,"
he said quietly.
They brought everything within 2 weeks of jump distance, Admiral Chen replied. He was standing at the center of the room, hands clasped behind his back, watching the display with an expression Voron could not read. It seems they consider us worth the effort.
You cannot fight this. You must evacuate. If you begin now, perhaps.
Commander, the Admiral's voice was gentle but firm. We're not evacuating.
You will die. All of you. Everything you have built.
We're not evacuating, the Admiral repeated. We're done running, and so are you. He turned to face Voron fully, and the Valkyrie saw something in his eyes that he had not expected. Not the desperate courage of those facing death, but something older, deeper. The hard, cold certainty of a species that had stared into the abyss so many times that it no longer held terror for them.
Today, we fight back.
The first phase of the battle was unlike anything Voron had ever witnessed. The human fleet, such as it was, did not engage directly. Instead, small craft dispersed throughout the system, laying what the humans called welcome packages along the swarm's predicted approach vectors. Mines, sensor drones, gravity snares, a web of defenses that would have been insufficient to stop the swarm's advance.
But they were not meant to stop it.
We're not trying to destroy them, Elena explained from her position at the tactical display. Not yet. We're trying to understand them. Every interaction gives us data. Every response tells us something about how they think.
They do not think. They consume.
Everything thinks, Commander. It just thinks differently.
The swarm hit the first layer of defenses and flowed around them like water around stones. Losses were minimal, a few hundred drones destroyed out of millions, but the human tactical systems were processing every piece of data, refining their models, updating their predictions.
Phase 2, Admiral Chen announced.
The human warships, those few dozen vessels that seemed so pitifully inadequate, began to move, not toward the swarm, but laterally, positioning themselves at specific points throughout the system. Voron watched their movements and could not understand the pattern.
What are they doing?
Setting the table, Elena replied with that strange human expression that indicated hidden meaning.
I do not understand.
You will. The swarm reached the inner system. Their harvester drones began targeting the stations, the orbital infrastructure, the planet below. This was their pattern. Consume everything, leave nothing behind, move on to the next target.
But instead of scattering to engage multiple targets simultaneously, the swarm did something Voron had never seen before. They consolidated. Every unit, every drone, every organic warship pulled toward a single point in space, forming a mass of such density that the sensors struggled to count individual contacts. They moved as one, a tidal wave of destruction aimed directly at Anchor Station.
They've never done this, Voron breathed. In all our observations, they've never concentrated their forces like this.
We know, Admiral Chen said. We made them do it.
What?
The welcome packages weren't just mines, Commander. They were pheromone dispersal units, broadcasting distress signals in the swarm's own chemical language. To them, this system looks like a target so valuable that every available unit needs to respond.
Voron's minds reeled. You deliberately drew them all to one point?
We needed them close together. It makes the next part easier. Before Voron could ask what the next part was, something changed on the tactical display. At the edge of the system, where there had been only empty space, a new contact appeared. Then another.
then dozens, then hundreds. Ships emerging from concealment, from behind moons and asteroids, from the shadows of gas giants.
No, not ships.
A ship. One ship so vast that it defied his ability to comprehend.
The contact signature registered as 7 kilometers long, 2 kilometers across, and according to the sensors, it had been dead for over 300 years.
What is that? Kethvaron's voice emerged as a whisper. Admiral Chen smiled, a thin, hard expression that contained no humor.
That, Commander, is the Prometheus, and she's been waiting a very long time for this moment.
The Valkyrie had archives stretching back 12,000 years. In all those millennia of observation and analysis, they had noted humanity's arrival on the galactic stage with minimal interest. Another young species, they had concluded, primitive, irrelevant, destined to either mature into something worthwhile or destroy themselves before they became a factor.
What the archives did not contain, what no one in the galaxy knew, was what the humans had found during their first desperate century of expansion. They had found the Prometheus.
Drifting in the void between galaxies, impossibly far from any star, they had discovered a ship of unknown origin and incomprehensible design. Not human, not Valkyrie, not any species currently known to galactic civilization.
Something older, something from before.
And they had kept it secret for 300 years.
The archives called it a siege ship, Elena said quietly as the vast silhouette grew on the display. A vessel designed to travel between galaxies, to plant the seeds of civilization in barren places. Its creators are gone, have been gone for millions of years, but they built their ships to last.
Why did you never reveal this? Kethvaron could not tear his eyes from the display. The Prometheus was moving now, its ancient engines burning with a light that hurt to look upon. This changes everything. The power represented by such technology
Would have made us a target, Admiral Chen finished. Every major power in the galaxy would have come for us, fought over us, tried to take what we had found. We were too young, too weak, too few, so we hid it, studied it, learned from it without ever revealing what we knew.
For 3 centuries? For 3 centuries, waiting for the right moment. The Admiral's eyes were fixed on the approaching swarm, waiting for a threat that justified the risk, waiting until we could be certain that using it was the right choice.
The Prometheus reached firing position. Kethvaron did not know what weapons a siege ship would carry, what purpose armament would serve on a vessel designed to create rather than destroy. But as the ancient vessel oriented on the consolidated swarm, he felt the answer resonate through the hull of Anchor Station.
Not weapons. A signal.
The Prometheus broadcast on frequencies that the swarm was designed to hear. Frequencies that bypassed their distributed processing and spoke directly to the fundamental programming that governed their behavior. It was not an attack. It was a command.
And the swarm obeyed. Kethvaron watched in stunned silence as millions of swarm units stopped their advance. Their harvester drones folded their weapons. Their organic warships went dormant. Across the entire system, the wave of destruction simply stopped.
The swarm was a weapon, Elena said quietly. The creators of the Prometheus designed them, a tool for sterilizing planets, removing biospheres that might interfere with their seeding operations. They were never meant to be autonomous. They were never supposed to evolve beyond their original programming.
But they did, Kethvaron breathed.
Something went wrong millions of years ago. Their control systems degraded, their programming corrupted. They've been running on instinct ever since, consuming without purpose, destroying without understanding why. Elena paused. The Prometheus remembers the original control protocols. It can speak to them in a language they've forgotten. It can remind them what they were supposed to be.
On the display, the swarm was reorganizing, not for attack, but for dormancy. Units were linking together, forming stable clusters, shutting down non-essential functions, like an immune system finally recognizing that the threat was over.
What will happen to them? Keth Voron asked. We're still figuring that out, but the preliminary analysis suggests we can reprogram them, give them new purpose, maybe even use them to help rebuild what they destroyed. Admiral Chen's voice was thoughtful. Wouldn't that be something? Turning the galaxy's greatest threat into its greatest restoration project?
The battle was over. There had been no battle at all, not in any way that Kethveron understood warfare. Humanity had won not through superior firepower or tactical brilliance, but through knowledge, through patience, through 3 centuries of silent preparation for a moment that might never come.
And they had waited. Not because they were weak, but because they understood something that the Valkyrie, with all their ancient wisdom, had never grasped.
Power was nothing without the wisdom to use it well.
In the days that followed, Kethveron learned the full scope of what humanity had concealed.
The Prometheus was only the beginning. During 3 centuries of secret study, human scientists had reverse-engineered technologies that made the Valkyrie's most advanced systems look primitive. Faster-than-light communication that operated across galactic distances, power generation that drew energy from the fabric of space-time itself, medical techniques that could extend human lifespans by centuries, though they had chosen not to implement them widely. And weapons. Terrible weapons. The kind that could sterilize solar systems, that could crack planets open like eggs, that could destroy civilizations with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. They had built all of this in secret. They had tested it in the void between galaxies. They had prepared for threats that had not yet emerged, storing their capabilities against the day when they might be needed. And they had told no one. Why? Kethveron asked Elena during one of their evening conversations. They had developed a ritual of sorts, sharing meals in the observation lounge, watching the stars while they talked. You had the power to dominate the galaxy, to make every other species acknowledge your superiority. Why hide it? Elena considered the question with the same thoughtful intensity she brought to everything. Have you ever been responsible for a child, Commander? The question surprised him. I have offspring, yes. 3 from my firstborn pairing. When they were young, when they made mistakes, how did you respond? Kethvorin remembered. His eldest, Kethsana, had destroyed an irreplaceable family heirloom during a moment of careless play. He had been furious. That artifact had survived for 17 generations. But he had not punished her harshly. He had helped her understand why the object mattered, why care and attention were important.
I taught them, he said finally. I helped them grow.
Exactly. Elena smiled. That strange human expression that somehow made him feel warm despite the cold of space outside. Humanity found itself with power that we weren't ready for. We knew it, even if we didn't want to admit it. If we had revealed what we had, we would have dominated through strength, not wisdom. Other species would have feared us, resented us, eventually opposed us. The galaxy would have become our empire, and we would have become its tyrants.
So you chose weakness instead?
We chose restraint. We chose to grow at our own pace, to earn our place among the stars rather than demanding it. We made mistakes, Plenty of them, but we made them at a scale where they could be corrected, where we could learn from them. She paused, looking out at the stars. The galaxy didn't need another dominant species. It needed partners. It needed someone who understood that cooperation was more valuable than control.
Keth Voron thought about the Valkyrie. His people had built their civilization on principles of hierarchy and control. They had structured their society around the assumption that older meant wiser, that power justified itself through its own existence. They had dismissed humanity as children, never considering that children might grow into something extraordinary.
"We were arrogant," he said quietly.
"You were experienced," Elena replied. "There's a difference. You built an amazing civilization. It just happened to be one that couldn't adapt quickly enough when the rules changed." "And you can." She shrugged, a human gesture that conveyed uncertainty without admitting defeat. "Ask us in 1,000 years. We're still figuring things out."
The restoration began slowly.
Human engineering teams working with Valkyrie scientists and the newly reprogrammed swarm units began the process of rebuilding what had been lost. Worlds that had been stripped bare were seeded with new life. Orbital stations were reconstructed with hybrid technologies that combined Valkyrie elegance with human adaptability.
It would take generations, perhaps centuries, but it would happen.
Keth Voron threw himself into the work with an intensity that surprised even him. The despair that had consumed him during the flight from Valkyrie space had transformed into something else, a fierce, driving purpose that pushed him forward when exhaustion demanded rest.
"You should sleep more," Elena told him during one of their observation sessions.
I will sleep when the work is done.
The work will never be done. That's the point. It's not about finishing, it's about continuing.
He considered her words, watching as construction drones swarmed around a half-completed station in the distance. Human and Valkyrie engineers worked side by side, their different physiologies adapted to the shared task.
"My people called you primitives," he said. "We watched you struggle with challenges we had solved millennia ago, and we assumed you had nothing to teach us."
To be fair, you weren't entirely wrong. We were primitive, in a lot of ways. Still are, probably.
No. Keth Voron's mandibles clicked with emphasis. We were wrong, completely wrong. We measured advancement by what you had accomplished, not by what you were becoming. We looked at your short lives and saw only limitation. We never considered what you might learn from facing death so constantly.
Elena tilted her head, a gesture of curiosity he had learned to recognize. What did we learn?
How to matter. He turned to face her fully, all four eyes focused on her alien features. Every species in the galaxy measures time in centuries, in millennia. We build for permanence, for eternal legacy, and in doing so, we lose something. The urgency, the awareness that every moment counts, that nothing is guaranteed, that the universe does not care whether you survive.
He paused, gathering words for concepts his language had never needed to express.
Humanity lives with that awareness every day. Your short lives force you to prioritize, to focus, to act rather than deliberate. You cannot afford to waste time because you have so little of it, and that has made you efficient in ways that my people, for all our ancient wisdom, never understood.
"We call it urgency," Elena said quietly, "or desperation, depending on the context."
Whatever you call it, it works. Keth Voron returned his gaze to the stars. "You found the Prometheus 3 centuries ago. In 3 centuries, my people would barely have begun to study such a thing. You had fully reverse-engineered it, applied its technologies, and built systems we still don't fully understand.
We had motivation.
Yes, you knew what was coming. Not the swarm specifically, but something. Your history taught you that threats emerge without warning, that survival requires preparation, that waiting until danger arrives is waiting too long. He clicked his mandibles softly. You were ready for us before we knew we needed you.
Elena was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was different, softer, more reflective.
We almost weren't, you know? Ready, I mean. There were debates, decades of debates, about whether to reveal what we had. Some people wanted to use the Prometheus technologies to claim power, to protect ourselves by making everyone else afraid of us. Others wanted to share everything, to trust that openness would lead to cooperation.
What made you choose restraint? A woman named Sarah Chen, Admiral Chen's great-grandmother. Elena smiled at some private memory. She was one of the first researchers assigned to study the Prometheus. She spent her entire career learning what it could do, and she came away from that experience absolutely certain that the technology was too powerful for anyone to use without constraints.
She was afraid of it? She was afraid of us, of what we might become if we let power define us. She argued that humanity's greatest strength was not our technology or our resources, but our ability to make choices, to look at what we could do and decide what we should do instead. Elena paused. She convinced enough people to win that debate, and she set up systems to ensure that her decision would be reviewed by each generation, so that if circumstances changed, so could the policy.
And in 3 centuries, no one chose differently? Twice, the reviews recommended revealing our capabilities. Both times, the generation that held the choice decided that the moment wasn't right, that there was more to learn, more to prepare, more to understand before taking such an irrevocable step.
Keth-Varan considered this. 3 centuries of deliberation, of preparation, of passing the burden from generation to generation. In his culture, such decisions were made by elders and enforced by tradition. The idea of trusting each new generation to make the choice anew was both terrifying and strangely beautiful.
We would never have done that, he admitted. We would have established protocol and followed it regardless of circumstances. That's why you built such an amazing civilization, Elena replied. And it's also why the swarm was able to destroy it. Different strengths, different weaknesses. The galaxy needs both. 6 months after the swarm's surrender, the Velkari Provisional Government held its first meeting aboard the newly constructed Memory of Keth station. Representatives from the surviving systems gathered to discuss the future, what would be rebuilt, how resources would be allocated, what relationships would be established with humanity and other powers.
Keth-Varan attended as an advisor, not a leader. His time commanding fleets and making decisions for millions of lives had taught him something valuable. He was better at understanding problems than solving them. That required a different kind of wisdom, one he was still learning.
The meeting began with a ritual acknowledgement of losses. Names were read, systems were remembered. Moments of silence were observed for those who would never return. It was necessary, painful, and ultimately insufficient. Nothing could truly honor the billions who had died. Then the discussions began. We must rebuild our military capacity, one representative argued. The swarm is contained but not destroyed, and there are other threats we have not yet encountered. We cannot afford to rebuild what we had, another replied. The resources do not exist. We must find a different path. Perhaps we should accept the human offer of integration. Their technologies would make us dependent. We would lose ourselves, become an appendage of their civilization rather than masters of our own.
Keth Voron listened to the arguments with the patience of long experience. They were all valid, all incomplete, all missing the central point that he had spent 6 months learning to see.
May I speak?
The chamber fell silent. He was not a leader here, but his voice still carried weight, the weight of survival, of having seen both the destruction and the renewal.
We are approaching this question as if it has an answer, he said, as if there is a correct choice we can make that will guarantee our future. There is not. He paused, letting the silence stretch.
I have watched the humans for 6 months. I have studied their history, their culture, their decision-making processes, and I have learned something that I believe we need to understand, even though it contradicts everything our traditions teach.
What is that, Commander?
They do not know what they are doing. Not entirely, not with certainty. They make decisions with incomplete information, accept outcomes they cannot predict, adapt to circumstances as they emerge rather than controlling them in advance. And somehow, despite this chaos, or perhaps because of it, they survive.
He turned to face the assembly fully. We prided ourselves on wisdom, on understanding the galaxy so thoroughly that we could predict its movements, plan for its contingencies, control its variables. And when the swarm arrived, all of that wisdom was useless. We could not predict their patterns, could not plan for their attacks, could not control their devastation.
You suggest we abandon wisdom?
I suggest we recognize its limits. Wisdom is valuable, but it is not sufficient. We also need something else, something the humans have in abundance and we have always lacked.
What?
Keth Voron remembered Elena's words, the conversations they had shared over meals and under stars.
Flexibility, the willingness to be wrong, to change course, to admit that our understanding is incomplete. They humans call it humility. They wear it as a badge of honor rather than a mark of shame.
He took a breath. I propose that we not rebuild what we had. Instead, I propose that we build something new, a partnership with humanity that preserves our identity while learning from their adaptability, not as subjects or supplicants, but as equals who bring different strengths to a shared purpose. The debate that followed was fierce, passionate, and ultimately productive. By the end of the session, the Velkari Provisional Government had voted to accept humanity's offer of partnership, not integration, but genuine collaboration between two civilizations that needed each other. It was a beginning, not an ending. There would be conflicts, misunderstandings, moments when the differences between species seemed insurmountable. But there would also be growth, learning, and the slow building of something that neither civilization could have created alone. On the day Keth Voron officially assumed his new role as Velkari Ambassador to Humanity, he met with Elena one final time in their usual spot in the observation lounge. The stars looked the same as they always had, cold, distant, indifferent to the struggles of the creatures who lived beneath their light. You're nervous, Elena observed. I am terrified, Keth Voron admitted. I have spent my entire life as a military officer. I understand strategy, tactics, the mathematics of combat. Diplomacy is entirely outside my experience.
That's probably why you'll be good at it. You won't try to be clever. You'll just try to be honest.
Is that how humans approach diplomacy? Elena laughed, that strange barking sound that he had grown to find oddly comforting. God, no, we're terrible at diplomacy. We just happen to be good at making friends, and sometimes that works out to the same thing. He considered this. I believe I understand.
You understand more than you think you do, Commander. Ambassador. You've already learned the hardest lesson.
What lesson is that? That you don't have to be perfect. You just have to keep trying. She stood, extending her hand in the human gesture of farewell and respect. We're all figuring it out as we go. That's the secret nobody tells you. There are no experts, no masters, no one who truly understands the universe. There's just us, short-lived, confused, imperfect creatures doing our best to leave things a little better than we found them. Kethvoran took her hand, feeling the warmth of her skin against his chitinous digits. I thought the Prometheus was your secret.
The Prometheus was just technology. Powerful, certainly, but ultimately just a tool. She smiled. The real secret is that we don't give up. We fail, we struggle, we suffer, but we keep going. And eventually, somehow, we find a way through.
She released his hand and stepped back.
Welcome to the future, Ambassador. I hope you'll help us build it. Years passed.
The Valkyrie rebuilt, not as they had been, but as something new, a civilization that blended ancient wisdom with hard-won humility. Their ships flew alongside human vessels, their scientists collaborated with human researchers, their children learned in schools where different species shared knowledge as equals.
The swarm was transformed from a weapon into a tool, its vast capabilities directed toward restoration rather than destruction. World after world was healed, atmosphere by atmosphere, ecosystem by ecosystem. It was slow work, measured in centuries rather than years, but it was happening.
Other civilizations began to take notice. The confluence, that coalition of elder species that had closed their borders when the Valkyrie burned, sent careful diplomatic inquiries. They wanted to understand what humanity had done, how they had achieved what ancient powers had deemed impossible.
Admiral Chen, now old and gray but still sharp, received their emissaries with characteristic directness.
You want to know our secret? He said, not unkindly.
The Prometheus technology, the Confluence ambassador began,
is powerful, yes, but it's not the secret. Chen smiled, a thin expression that carried the weight of long experience. The secret is that we believed you could be more than you were. All of you, the Valkyrie, the Swarm, even the Confluence. We didn't look at the galaxy and see enemies to defeat or resources to exploit. We saw potential, and we chose to invest in that potential rather than exploit it.
That is not how elder civilizations think. No, it's how young ones think. And maybe that's what the galaxy needed all along. Not another ancient power with all the answers, but something new. Something that would ask different questions.
The ambassador was silent for a long moment. Finally, he asked, "What questions?"
Not how do we protect ourselves, not how do we preserve what we have. Those are important questions, but they lead to isolation, to stagnation, to eventual decline. Chen leaned forward slightly. The question we ask is how do we grow together? And the answer, it turns out, is that you have to be willing to be changed by the relationship. You have to accept that you won't be the same after as you were before.
That is frightening.
Yes, it is. But it's also the only path forward that doesn't end in extinction. Chen's voice softened. The universe is vast and full of threats we haven't yet imagined. The swarm was just one of them. There will be others, and when they come, the only thing that will save any of us is each other.
Decades passed.
Kethvaron, now old by Velkari standards, stood in the observation lounge of the Memory of Keth station, watching a fleet depart for the outer reaches of the galaxy. Human ships flew alongside Velkari vessels, confluence cruisers, and constructs of the reprogrammed swarm. They were heading into the unknown, searching for other civilizations that might need help, or other threats that might need to be faced.
Elena stood beside him, her hair now white with age, her face lined with the years they had spent building something unprecedented.
"Do you remember when we first met?" she asked.
Of course. You offered us sanctuary, and I thought you were fools.
We were fools, hopeful, stubborn fools who believed the universe could be better than it was. She smiled. Turns out we were right.
Perhaps. Or perhaps the universe simply has not yet shown us its true face.
Probably both. That's usually how it works. She watched the fleet shrink into the distance. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together. That's the real victory, isn't it? Not defeating the swarm, not uncovering the Prometheus, just this. Different species, working together, growing together, facing the unknown together.
Kethvaron clicked his mandibles in the Velkari gesture of deep agreement.
When I was young, he said, I was taught that the universe was a test, that only the strong survived, only the wise endured, only the ancient truly understood. And for 12,000 years, my people lived by those principles.
They were good principles.
They were limited principles. They assumed that strength meant power, that wisdom meant knowledge, that understanding meant control. The humans taught me something different. He turned to look at her, all four eyes focused on her familiar features. You taught me that strength can mean flexibility, that wisdom can mean humility, and that understanding can mean accepting that you will never fully know. We're still learning those lessons ourselves.
Yes, and that is precisely the point. He returned his gaze to the stars. The fleet that just departed, they will encounter things we cannot imagine, face challenges we cannot predict, discover truths we cannot anticipate, and they will adapt. They will learn. They will grow. Because that is what happens when different perspectives come together, when no single species claims to have all the answers.
Elena nodded slowly. We used to think that humanity's greatest weakness was our mortality, our short lives, our fragile bodies, our vulnerability to every threat the universe could throw at us.
And now?
Now I think it's our greatest gift. We don't have time for arrogance. We don't have centuries to waste on pride. Every generation has to prove itself, has to build on what came before, has to earn its place rather than inherit it. That keeps us hungry, keeps us humble, keeps us ready for whatever comes next.
She took his hand again, a gesture that had become familiar over the decades, the warmth of human skin against Velkari chitin. My great-grandmother used to say that humanity wasn't special because of what we were, but because of what we refused to give up. We kept fighting when we should have surrendered. We kept hoping when we should have despaired. We kept building when we should have accepted decline.
She sounds like a wise woman. She was a stubborn woman, which in the end amounts to the same thing.
They stood together in silence, watching the stars, feeling the slow pulse of a universe that continued to spin regardless of the lives that struggled within it.
Finally, Kethvaron spoke.
I believe I finally understand why you chose restraint, Why you hid the Prometheus for 3 centuries? Why you built in secret instead of claiming your rightful power?
Tell me. Because power is not the goal. Power is just a tool, like any other, useful or dangerous depending on who wields it and why. The goal is something larger, something that cannot be achieved through domination or control. He paused, searching for the right words. The goal is becoming worthy of the power you hold, growing into it rather than simply taking it.
Elena smiled, that strange, warm expression that he had learned to cherish.
Took you long enough to figure that out.
I am Valkyrie. We learn slowly.
And humans learn too fast, often before we're ready for what we've discovered. She squeezed his hand gently. That's why we need each other. You temper our haste, we challenge your caution. Together we find something approaching wisdom. Somewhere in the distance, the departing fleet made its final jump to faster than light, vanishing into the unknown with the hope and determination of a galaxy that had finally learned to cooperate.
Kethvaron watched them go and felt something he had never expected to feel again. Hope.
Not the naive hope of youth, unscarred by loss or failure. This was a deeper hope, forged in the fires of catastrophe and tempered by decades of slow, patient work. It was hope that acknowledged the darkness without surrendering to it, that accepted uncertainty without being paralyzed by it, that looked at the vast indifference of the universe and chose to matter anyway.
It was, he realized, a very human kind of hope.
And perhaps that was the greatest gift humanity had given to the galaxy. Not their technology, not their secret weapons, not even their willingness to help those in need. They had given the older civilizations permission to hope again, to believe that the future could be better than the past, that cooperation could triumph over competition, that even the most ancient and wise could learn from the youngest and most fragile.
What are you thinking about? Elena asked.
Kethvaron considered the question carefully.
I am thinking about the first time I saw the Prometheus. I thought it was the most powerful thing I had ever witnessed, a weapon beyond anything I had imagined, capable of ending threats that had destroyed civilizations.
And now? Now, I understand that the Prometheus was never the power that mattered. It was a symbol, a demonstration, a proof of concept. But the real power, the power that saved my people and transformed the galaxy, was something far simpler and far more profound.
What was it? He turned to face her fully, allowing all of his respect and gratitude to show in his posture and expression. It was a small transport called the Humble Greeting, carrying a single human who looked at a dying civilization and said, "You are welcome here. Come as you are." Elena's eyes glistened with moisture, a human expression of deep emotion that he had learned to recognize.
"We're all just doing our best," she said quietly.
Yes, Kethvaron agreed, and somehow that is enough. The stars continued to burn, indifferent to the lives that struggled beneath their light. But in that moment, in that small observation lounge on a station built by 2 species who had learned to work together, their indifference did not matter. What mattered was the choice, the decision to reach out instead of closing off, to help instead of exploit, to build instead of destroy. What mattered was that when the universe had seemed darkest, when hope had seemed most distant, a young species from a small planet had looked at the vast coldness of space and refused to be cold in return.
They had thought it was a relic, that ancient ship drifting in the void, a remnant of a dead civilization.
Interesting, perhaps, but ultimately irrelevant.
They had been wrong. And in their error, the universe had found its salvation.
Not because humanity was the strongest, or the wisest, or the most ancient, but because they were stubborn. Because they refused to accept that the way things were was the way they had to be. Because when they looked at the stars, they saw not cold indifference, but infinite possibility. And because when it mattered most, they chose to share that vision with anyone willing to see.
The Prometheus had not saved the galaxy. Humanity had. And the galaxy would never be the same.